Good evening, everybody. Hi, Haley, Casey, Wakefield, Morgan, Sarah, Socombe, or Bunny, Becky. How's everybody doing tonight?
Everybody's on mute.
Just a reminder, if you're sharing the same screen, go ahead and put your names in the group chat. You see here, I'm on the REI website, and this is something Steve Gahn highlighted to me. They are in the middle of their peak sale, and they do it every year around this time of year. And one of the things we found is that on their peak deals, we've got these REI Co-op Jewel 21 women's sleeping bag, and that is $160 for a 2-pound 3-ounce 700 down bag with an EN comfort rating of 21 degrees. That's a heck of a deal.
Yeah.
They also have, looks like the men's, the Igneo 17 is also 50% off right now.
Oh, wow.
So, and then
Yeah.
it's a EN. Men tend to sleep warmer. That's why it's an EN lower limit of 17. But same thing, you can get it for just under 2 pounds, 700 down. I think they have some 25, 30. I think they might have some. They have different temperature ratings as well. But just something to think of through May 25th. We wanted to highlight as people are doing their shopping, getting their last gear. This is one of the best REI sales of the year that you'll see. And it looks like their sleeping bags really hit a good price point to performance for what you get weight wise, down fill power wise, and fabrics. I think, what is it saying? They're using ripstop nylon 20D. So that's industry standard stuff. This is a pretty high quality sleeping bag, and right now it's 50% off.
Yeah, that's a great deal, Casey. Thanks for sharing that with us.
See, we've got a lot of other people coming in. Just a reminder, if you're sharing the same screen, go ahead and put your name in the group chat for us so we can track attendance. I think most everybody is at 5 classes attended so far. So everybody, for the most part, should be eligible to sign up for a graduation backpack if you want. And they're still subject to the COVID-19 restrictions, but we do hope to do them later in the year. And then at the happy hour we had on Friday, I think it was not Becky. Somebody else was talking about they were looking for a group of women to go and to find hiking partners with. And so, Sarah, you might be able to speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. I'd love to. It's always exciting. I remember last year doing this very class, and that's where the Outdoor Ladies of Eastern Washington Facebook group spawned from, was from backpacking school. After the class last year, I had a whole bunch of women come up and want to talk to me, and they all kept saying, I don't have anyone to backpack with. I don't have anyone to backpack with. I'm like, well, there's like 5 of you who want to backpack. So we did a happy hour, and we had 40 women show up to the happy hour. Like, that was really crazy. So then we decided to start a group, and we have over 550 people, women in the Outdoor Ladies group right now. So, hey, Terry. It's
Hi,
pretty
Terry.
cool. we're definitely in the same boat of trying to figure out how to still adventure while with all the orders in place. But hopefully things will start opening back up soon, and we can start planning some trips.
Yeah, and I have gotten the trip sign up emails. I've gotten several of them. Chella, I've got yours. Haley, I think I've got yours as well. I've just been swamped lately with work and yard projects, and also, doing backpacking school. But I will get to them, and I do have them in my inbox.
Hey, Dawn, you say Oregon is open today, even the gorge? I can't hear you because you're muted. Now you're cussing, I think. Can't hear you.
I started typing, and so I was getting spaces.
Oh, okay.
In the thing. Anyway, the Baker County Circuit Court judge ruled that the stay-in-place order in Oregon is null and void, and unless the state Supreme Court overrules that, the whole state's wide open.
Wow. Wow. Well, I will follow that. Thank you.
Well, okay, so we're getting close to. Oh yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. We're getting close to 6:30. I just wanted to highlight one more time. The REI is having their annual sale through May 25th, and the Jewel for women's, or in men's they call it the Igneo series. These sleeping bags are both 50% off right now, and they come with 700 filled down and a very competitive weight. They're very highly rated, or I guess the specs are very, very good on these sleeping bags, and they get good reviews, and they're from REI. So if you are still looking for a sleeping bag, Steve Gahn and I wanted to highlight that the REI's got some good deals on them right now.
And you guys probably all know this already, but REI also has a great return policy in case you don't like something that you buy from them. So it's always a good place to try to get something. If you're not sure of it, you can always return it.
So with that in mind, I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to Sarah.
All right.
She is going to cover Leave No Trace and first aid.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Lingley. I've been teaching this class for backpacking school. This is my third year. My background is that a few years back, took a wilderness first responder class to get my certification. It's a 10-day class. I thought that was really important. I did that specifically because I was running a business where I took women hiking, so I wanted to have that certification. I think it was really important. I also am CPR and first aid certified. I'll get started here. So first thing I wanted to say with this class, I'd like to tell everyone this, is that first aid is really important to learn and know and understand how to perform, especially when you're in the backcountry. And this is just an overview course, just a sampling to give you an idea of some of the topics you should become familiar with. I'll share some specific classes with you you can take, but I always encourage anybody who's going to do a significant amount of backcountry adventures to actually get some actual certification training, either a wilderness first aid or wilderness first responder, or at least your CPR first aid training, so that this is really just meant to be an overview and you don't get any specific certifications from it, but it is good information. Let's see if I can figure out how to go. So overview of the agenda, we're going to go over the basic first aid for in the wilderness. We'll talk about planning and preparing ahead of your trip, what you can do to make sure you're prepared ahead of leaving for your trip. Fundamental types of hazards, preventative care, what to do when an accident happens, how to manage some basic injuries, how to handle some more advanced injuries, what kind of things you want to have in your first aid kit, and then some additional resources. So the bottom line is, if you're going into the backcountry, you should have solid training in wilderness first aid. And so there's actually a difference between urban first aid and first aid that you would do in a wilderness situation. So if you're like on your sidewalk and something happens, what do? You call 911, right? Like that's your first step, is to call 911. If you're in the backcountry, no one is within, they call it here 2 hours from definitive medical care. That's what puts you in a wilderness context. So if you're 2 hours from like a hospital, then you're in a wilderness context. You're not able to call 911 and get the emergency first responder. So you kind of become the emergency first responder. So first aid in the backcountry is a little different than first aid that you would do in the urban setting. Now, of course, there's some overlaps, but typically in an urban setting, the first thing you want to do is try to get a higher level of care. So calling for the ambulance so that they can handle the situation, and then you're just managing it in the short window of time between when they get there and from when you call to when they get there, versus when you're in the backcountry, it could be over 2 hours, even longer, maybe days. So it's a different situation and it requires different skills. So one of the best things you can do before you go out on your venture is to prepare. And this is kind of like, I know you guys have all talked about like what gear to take and, how to plan your trips and those types of things, but here's some specific stuff about first aid. So first thing you want to do is know yourself and know your friends or the people you're hiking with. It's really important to the degree of comfort of the people you're hiking with, understand if they have any medical conditions that could cause a problem on the trail, and to know if they're taking any medications. I know in this day and age, everyone's a little bit sensitive about health and medication topics, but at least let the trip leader know if you've had any heart problems, if you have asthma, if you have any allergies. That way they can assist you if something happens, or you can assist somebody else if something happens to them. I have some examples on the right-hand side of the screen. A really good example is if somebody has asthma, if somebody else on the trip knows where their inhaler is, they can help them get to it. Maybe it's in their pack and they're having a hard time getting in their pack and, dealing with their asthma attack. You might be able to assist them. Knowing if somebody has a serious allergy to such as like bees. Some people who have allergies to bees carry EpiPens. Knowing where their EpiPen is in their bag could help them. And then one of the last ones I thought was really interesting that they taught us in the wilderness first responder class was that if somebody has diabetes and they have a situation where they like faint, if they have diabetes, you can give them a little bit of sugar in their mouth, and that actually can help revive them depending on the situation. It won't hurt them, but it could help them. So it's helpful to know that somebody had diabetes, because if they just fainted and you know what was happening, you might not think to give them some sugar. So that's just a really good example of a way that you can help somebody that's on your trip. So I know we use the Backpacker's Field Manual for this class. I actually have it right here. I love this. It's pretty exciting. I have one. Get a copy. Pretty cool. Lots of good info in there. In the back, in the appendix, there's actually a fitness and health form that you could use to put together like a really basic like questionnaire for people who are going on your trips, or you can just ask in a conversation. But that will give you some guidance on the types of questions that you might want to ask to make sure you understand the different like medical conditions of the people going with you. The next thing you want to do is prepare. So for your gear, you'll want to have your first aid kit. We'll talk about that a little later, the different elements of that. Rain gear to keep you dry. I'm sure this has been talked about before, but this is very important for your health and well-being, especially if you get in a situation where you get injured and you have to stay put for a long period of time. You're going to get a lot colder than if you're hiking along. So keep in mind that sometimes this extra gear you bring is because you might actually have to be sitting in one place for a long time, maybe on an exposed ridge too. You don't always get to control where the injury happens. So trying to think in advance of having the right things in case you have to sit for a long period of time on the ground. And in addition to the rain gear, to have your warm layers. Another thing to prepare on is the weather conditions. So to make sure that you have the full gear, and also just going into a trip knowing what the weather conditions are going to be like, you're going to be more aware of how to take care of yourself and be proactive on taking care of yourself, making sure you're not getting cold, making sure you're not getting wet, being proactive in your safety. And then the last thing is to know is the trail conditions. So are you going on a trail that has loose rocks? Is there cliff drop-offs? Is there going to be patches of snow? Just being really thinking ahead about it. It's like that when people say like, oh, somebody says see the color red, and now you see the color red everywhere, right? So if you're already aware of potential like conditions that may cause hazards, then you'll be thinking about it before you get on the trail, and then you'll be more aware of them, and you won't be surprised when you encounter them. So I'm going to go over the 3 fundamental types of hazards. So if you guys want to do fun little thing here, we usually like have participants raise their hand or shout out answers. So if you want to use the chat box, what do you guys think are some environmental hazards that you might encounter while you are hiking? See if I can see the chat box from here. Let's see. Where is the chat box? There it is. All right. Yeah, bears, definitely, especially. Side note, I saw yesterday a post from the rangers saying that since there haven't been a lot of people out and about hiking, that there's a lot more bear activity near roads and trails just because there hasn't been as many people out. So keep that in mind while you're out there. Lightning, hail, falling rocks and logs, poison oak, absolutely, yikes. Smoke from fires, ooh, that's a good one. Okay, let's click on to the next screen here. So yeah, so absolutely, we've got rocky trails, the poison ivy or the poison oak, lightning, exposed ledges, snow and ice, bees, wasps, bears, put that on there too. Overexposure to the sun, rain, cold temperatures, and potentially contaminated water. Okay, so go back up to this screen. What about equipment hazards? What type of equipment hazards do you think you might encounter while you're hiking, backpacking? Kind of a clue in the picture there next to the bullet. Stove malfunction, yes. Cook stove malfunction. Shoes that don't fit right, definitely, that's a good one. Boots falling apart, yep. Yep, those are all good ones. Forgetting your tent stakes, that's definitely equipment hazard. Yep, pack straps rubbing on you. Yep, those are all good ones. So let's see what this list has. Your improper clothing, that could be not having the right clothing or having clothing that fails, having the shoes that don't fit right that are causing blisters. Even though blisters seem like such a small thing, they're really uncomfortable when you're hiking miles and miles and miles every day. So there's something you definitely want to take care of, and we're going to talk about those more later. Faulty stove, not only can you have some problems with it there, but if you also could have like boiling water could be a hazard from the stove. Inoperative equipment, missing equipment. I think you guys hit on this pretty good. I think your list is better than mine. I might have to update my list to have some of the items you have in there. I like the forgetting the tent stakes. That's definitely one. All right, last one, human hazards. What kind of hazards do you think humans can create for ourselves while we're hiking, backpacking? Crossing streams, getting lost. Okay, so how could you get lost? What kinds of things might you do that cause you to get lost? Like overestimate, exactly, like overestimating your abilities, going off trail bushwhacking because you overestimated your abilities to go off trail, maybe. What other kind of things? It's like in the vein of overestimating your abilities. Lots of things there for us to, yep, unable to read your map or your compass. Dehydration, yes. So dehydration can make you not as clear thinking. Hypothermia, same thing, yeah. All right, let's see, getting confused, definitely. So let's go down here. So your physical condition you're in, your previous experience that you've had. Have you hiked and backpacked in this kind of terrain before? Previous medical condition that can flare up, that we talked about those earlier. No awareness of the potential hazards. Like eating a poisonous mushroom, don't do that. I was hiking recently and took a picture of a mushroom and showed it to one of my friends who knows a lot about mushrooms, and she says, "Oh, that one's poisonous." I said, "Good, I'm glad I didn't touch it. I just took the picture." So not being aware that those things are hazards. I'm trying to prove oneself same thing as overestimating your abilities. Who's ever had the situation where you just wanted to make it to the summit? It was so close. It was so close. You just wanted to make it and you didn't want to turn back. But maybe you had to for some reason or another. Either you ran out of water, you hit your turn back time. Really, those are really important things to like have set in place before you go on a trip. Your turn back time, and just like anything that's going to cause you to make the decision to turn back, because it's really hard in the moment. You know, when you're like a quarter mile from the summit, you don't want to turn back, but maybe you're like 30 minutes past your turn back time and you just have to. And that's something that's really important, to make those decisions so that you aren't trying to prove yourself. You don't put yourself in a situation where maybe you're out there past dark, which is now beyond your abilities. So just keeping those things in mind, it's really easy to under or overestimate your abilities when you're out in the field. And that's why it's really good to kind of like know these like turn back times and conditions where you're going to stop before you even go out. Because that's happened to me a couple times and I don't like it. I didn't like that I had to like come back and didn't get, you know, but I made it back to the trailhead safely. And that's really the goal, is to get back to the trailhead safely versus getting to the summit being the goal. Fatigue, once you start getting tired, what happens? Yeah, summit fever for sure. What happens? You start to trip, right? Like when you get tired, you're gonna like start tripping over rocks. So if you don't stop, either take a rest, get some water, drink something, you could even fall even worse and hurt yourself. So try to be aware of these little human hazards that we create for ourselves. Anxiety and fear can be a big one. If you've ever been in a group with somebody who's like afraid of bears or afraid of heights, how that can impact the group. Again, knowing what you're comfortable doing and making sure that the trail, and that's why knowing what the trail conditions are, because if you're really afraid of heights, maybe you don't want to take a trail that has a lot of heights on it. You might want to know ahead of time, then pick a trail that fits what you enjoy. Limited outdoor skills, and then the last one, rushing, right? When you're summit fever, not only are you trying to prove yourself, but you might also be rushing, and rushing can lead to rolled ankles, and you can fall and hurt your arms and wrists. So these are some things that I think it's hard to see in ourselves, and maybe just watch out for your friends and watch out for each other. And if you start to notice someone tripping over rocks, you know, maybe like call a team break for everybody, and just be aware that it's really hard to identify these for yourselves and kind of do it for everyone on the team's sake. Okay, so the other thing you can do is do some preventative care. And you'll all laugh, right? Because this is kind of funny. We're all out hiking in the wilderness, and so a lot of the stuff is kind of like expected. But the preventative care is don't get wet, don't get tired, don't get hungry, don't get thirsty, don't get cold, and don't get too close to the edge. Well, it's kind of funny because it's all these things that, you know, we're going to probably have or encounter these on your trip. Trying to be proactive about not letting them happen will make you be in a situation where you're less likely to encounter a hazard. For me, I get really cold really fast at the end of a day. So as soon as we get to camp, I'm putting on my layers, and I think people like laugh at me because they're wearing shorts and I'm wearing my wool hat. But for me, once I get cold, I can't get warm. And so I try to never even get to the point where I'm starting to feel cold. Thirst means you're already starting to be dehydrated. So you should try to be not ever be thirsty. Like you should try to drink enough that you're not thirsty. And don't do the whole thing where you're not going to pee in the woods, so you're not going to drink water, because that doesn't end well either. Taking lots of breaks to eat, or even just eating while hiking. I like to keep little snacks right up in my pouches in my pockets of my bag, so I can just eat something while I'm walking. You should probably be eating like throughout the day when you're backpacking, as opposed to waiting until like lunchtime, because then it's also really hard to eat a lot and then hike. So eating a little bit across the day is really good. And then, you know, just asking for breaks or noticing if other people seem like they need to have breaks, and just taking breaks. A 5-minute break can do a lot for both your energy level and also your morale. Filter your drinking water. While most of the trips that we'll go on together are short enough that you probably won't get too sick until after you get back, having Giardia or Cryptosporidium, none of that is going to be good or enjoyable or a good part of memory of your trip. So filter your drinking water. Also, filters have a tendency to have a mind of their own and not always work properly. So having a backup option, I carry iodine tabs, or at least boiling your water at the very least for 1 minute rolling boil. But best to, if you can, to filter your drinking water, and if you're going with a group, to have more than one filter available. So in case one fails, you'll have safe drinking water. Wearing your proper clothing. Again, if a storm's rolling in, it might be a pain to have to take off your bag and put on your rain gear, but wet gear, doesn't keep you warm. Sometimes certain fabrics are hard to dry out, so you want to make sure that you're wearing the proper clothing. And also, we already talked about confirming your gear is operative. This is one I'm still working on. Here's another, we'll see if anyone else wants to put anything in the group chat about a story where you didn't confirm your gear was operative. And I'll tell you a quick little story from my experience. The very first time I went backpacking, I had gone to REI and bought all the gear, and I tried out most of it in my backyard. But the night before, or the night before I was going to actually go on the trip, I finally decided I was going to try out my stove. And at that time, I realized that I had the wrong gas for the stove that I had purchased. So luckily I was still in town and could go back to REI and get the right gas. But those are the things you want to find out while you're at home. Other things that I have found out while I'm on the trail, not so good, is that my batteries no longer have any power left in them in my headlamp. That's not good to find out, or that my filter is not working because I didn't backwash it properly before the trip. So those are my shares. And no one else wants to share, but hey, I'll own it. I'll admit I've had those things, and trust me, it's just much better to figure this out at the house when you have time and energy to get them resolved and not have to deal with them in the field. Oh, awesome. Somebody else shared. I bought a tent and didn't know how waterproof it was and took it to the Oregon coast and it flooded. Yeah, that's kind of a hard one to test. What do you like, put it up in your backyard and spray it with water? For sure. But yeah, definitely trying to figure out your gear, or at least try it out for the first time in a situation where you can abort the trip if you need to, is a good idea. Okay, so let's actually get to the part where we talk a little bit about what happens if and when an accident happens. Hopefully, we aren't getting into too many situations where we actually have an accident. But this is really the core part of what I want to talk to you about, and hope you can take away some of this. There's a lot of stuff on the screen, but stick with me. So the first thing when an accident happens on the backcountry is, whether it's happen to someone you're with, or someone you come across on the trail, like that you don't know that's somebody else. The first thing you want to do is to assess the scene. Don't panic, don't run in, assess the scene to make sure that the area is safe for you to approach the person who's been injured. Because remember, you want to keep yourself safe first, especially if you're not the injured one. So if something happened, like a rock slide happened, and you run over to help the person, and a secondary rock slide comes down and now you're injured too, that's just multiplying the difficulty of the rescue. So really, they emphasize this in the wilderness first responder training. When something happens, assess the scene to make sure it's safe first. And this really applies to specific cases like rock falling, if there was an avalanche, but it can really be important just in any condition. I mean, just to make sure that the scene is safe before you move in to help the person. And as you're assessing the scene, look for clues as to the cause of the injury. So like if the person was like behind you and hiking with you, you might not have actually seen what happened, and you might not be sure what happened, but maybe you see, like, again, like the pile of rocks, or like there's bees buzzing around, or there's a log that it looks like they tripped over. Try to get a sense of what might have happened as the first piece. Once you've identified that the scene is safe and you can approach the person, you want to do that. And then you do what we call an initial assessment. So the initial assessment is where you go and you look only for life-threatening conditions, because there's 3 things that, if you don't take care of right away, can lead to death. And so you're going to want to look for those ones first. The first one is airway, whether or not they're breathing. So either confirm that they don't have any, their airway isn't blocked, and confirm that they're breathing. That's number 1. Because you can only go 3 minutes without oxygen, right? The rule of 3 is 3 minutes without oxygen, 3 days without water, 3 weeks without food. So the 3 minutes without oxygen is number one. You want to check and make sure they're breathing. The second one is a severe bleed, like a significant bleed, not just a little cut that's bleeding a little bit, but like a significant bleed. And we'll talk a little bit later about what that will look like. You're going to want to stop that bleed immediately, because a significant bleed can be life-threatening pretty quickly. The third one that I don't really get into too much here is because you need a more advanced training, is confirming that the person has circulation throughout their body. This usually could indicate, if they don't have circulation throughout their body, could indicate internal bleeding, or that they have a bleed you just haven't notified or identified yet. The reason why you want to make sure that they have circulation is because you can lose like a hand, an arm, a limb, if there's a loss of circulation. Again, I'm not going to get too far into the details on how to do that, but I recommend that you maybe take the wilderness first aid training. That would teach you the way to figure it out. And it's essentially like, if they're cognizant, you can get them to move their fingers and like push against you, just making sure that they can still use their limbs. And then if you know where to take pulses, if you can feel a strong pulse on a limb, that means that there's good circulation. So there's just a kind of couple tips for you if you're wanting to know that. The next thing to do is so once you've got to do the initial assessment. You might have to roll the person over to like look and see what's happened on the backside, if they're like face up, or whatever you want to check, because you want to make sure they're not like bleeding from their back and you're only looking on the front. So you do want to like look them over good, but it is important to avoid moving a fall victim. And quite frankly, 3 feet is enough to actually injure you pretty bad. So any fall that's not from standing, if it's up on a rock, somebody jumped down off a rock or whatever, should be considered a fall victim, and they should not be moved. And the reason why is because it can cause paralysis if they have a damaged spine, especially in their neck. So if possible, if they're a fall victim, just get them comfortable as you can, but try not to move them. And so what you do, the first couple things you want to do is make sure they're warm and dry. So trying to get them onto like a sleep pad that keeps them off the ground, and then either putting them in a sleeping bag if it's really cold out, or just putting some like rain jackets over them to keep them warm and dry, because the body, those are the things that will help the body be able to handle whatever situation is. Obviously, this sounds a little extreme, but if someone's just scraped their arm, you're probably not going to go to this extreme extents to check everything. But it's really good to have a system to follow when you're out there, because it helps you not get as freaked out and to not panic if you have a system that you're going to follow. So assess the scene, do your initial assessment to check that they're breathing and that they're not bleeding profusely, and then move on to the focused assessment. And that's where you're going to identify all the injuries and possibly illnesses that need treatment. And keep in mind that this could be somebody faints, right? This may not be a bleed. It could be somebody faints and you don't know why. So that's more of on the illness side of things versus an injury. So both can be just as, difficult to deal with in the backcountry. And so when you do a focused assessment, what you're literally going to do, ask the person first if they're conscious, if you can like basically touch them across all their body. And what you do, they call it palpate, and you just use your hands and you start on the head and you just touch everywhere, and you kind of just lightly press. And you can notice if the person winces or groans or makes a noise, that there's a pain there, and you want to like keep going, but like document, okay, there was like they hit their head because there's an injury. And then you go down and you feel their arms, you go all the way down their arms, and you go all the way down their belly, you do their stomach, you do the 4 quadrants of their stomach, all the way down their legs essentially. And you want to document anything you find, for a couple reasons. One, because it will help you figure out what happened if you don't know. And 2, if you are calling in for a rescue, they're going to want to know about all the injuries so they can understand the urgency around it. So I'll tell you about it later, but one of the things that I encourage you to put in your first aid kit is actually a little piece of paper and one of those little like golf pencils or something that you can write with, so you can write this stuff down. One of the other things that we talk about is when you first come upon a person, you want to ask them 4 questions like, what is your name? Where are you? What's the date? You know, ask them 4 questions, and then hopefully they'll get them right. If they don't, if they can't answer them, that's a sign that they have a head injury. If they do get them right, that's good. You want to ask them again in like 20 minutes or another hour. This is obviously if it's a bigger injury, and that can help you determine if there is a decline in their mental status. So those are just a couple things for you to keep in mind if somebody sees, because it's the hardest ones are like the like a brain like injury or concussion. It's kind of hard. The person doesn't want you like, oh, I'm fine. So knowing some of these tips and tricks on like asking them the 4 questions, they might not realize that you're going to ask them again, and hopefully they get it answered right. But if they don't, you know that you need to take additional action to help them. And so the last thing you do after you've identified all the injuries is you come up with your treatment plan. The treatment plan could be, okay, we're going to dress your wound and we're going to like hike out, right? Or it could be, seems like he's just got a blister. We're gonna clean it, and he says he's fine to keep going. So we're gonna keep going in the adventure after we've figured out how to manage the pain and the injury. And the last one could be that you actually have to get evacuated and you have to call for help. So knowing the full, you want to assess the scene, do an initial assessment, make sure there's no life-threatening injuries, do your focused assessment, identify all injuries and illnesses, and then develop your plan after you have all the information. So if you can remember those 4 steps, even if it's a small injury, again, it's good to practice because nobody wants a big injury or illness to happen in the backcountry. But if you practice these steps with a smaller injury, it's going to make you much more likely to be able to really handle anything that comes along. So I'd encourage you to try it out even with little things like blisters, just to get into the habit. One thing we like to share is that if you have not been properly trained for a procedure, you can end up doing more harm end up causing more harm to the patient. You know, when you're in the backcountry, you want to help someone really bad, but if you don't know how to do something like for instance, trying to put an arm back in its socket or something like that, like you've probably seen it in the movies. It's like, yeah, you like do this and you push on it and you pull up, and don't try to do that in the field. It could do more harm than help the person. For instance, in that case, if the person has a dislocated arm from their shoulder, dislocated shoulder, you just want to strap the arm to their body and get them out of there. You don't want to try to put their arm back in the field. That's really not the best, unless you've been trained to and you're a doctor, and then maybe you can. But the point is, don't do something that you haven't been trained to do, because it can cause more harm. Okay, so let's talk about some basic injuries. Fortunately, major injuries are rare on the trail, but even the small ones can be just cause a lot of pain and discomfort. So the basic injuries we're going to talk about, you might have all actually already had these: blisters, burns, cuts, and scrapes. And so we'll go through these pretty quick, but they're good information to know how to take care of these, because they're probably going to happen to you on one of your adventures one of these days, and they're minor, so they're not a big deal, but you do want to take care of them appropriately so that you don't get sicker or injured more. So for managing blisters are essentially friction burns, and ideally you want to treat them before they actually occur, right? We're talking about preventative care, not getting cold and wet, not getting blisters. So the key is to prevent rubbing, and this goes back to making sure your boots fit properly. So make sure your boots fit properly and broken in before the trip starts. Making sure your gear works, not trying your boots for the first time while you're on your 10-day trip. Yeah, it's a good idea to try the boots out. Again, get them at REI. They will take them back if you don't like them. Walk around the house, go up Badger, whatever with them. Make sure they work for you and that they aren't causing you blisters before you go out in the backcountry. And note that when you put on weight, when you put on a backpack, it's gonna actually feel different in your boots. Like there's a different amount of weight in there. And then also as you hike, your feet are gonna swell, and that's also gonna make a difference. So I encourage you to really try to make sure that you've got the right boots before you start, and that will help prevent them before they start. Keeping your feet dry, I always carry an extra pair of socks. And on day hikes, I usually, if I remember, I'll actually change them at the turnaround point, either at the summit or whatever. That's just helpful to keep your feet nice and dry. If you're backpacking, you might just do it when you get to camp, you know, but just making sure if your feet do get wet, that you can change your socks is important. And then if you start to notice like a rubbing, even if it doesn't feel like it's a big deal, it's a good idea to check it out sooner than later. So yeah, you start to feel like a burning on like your heel or whatever, it just take 5 with the group. Say, hey, I just want to check out my foot. Take your boots off, take your socks off, figure out what's going on. If it looks like a blister is forming, you want to just go ahead and put something over it right now to prevent it from getting any worse, because hiking on blisters is not fun. So if you, excuse me 1 second. So if you find a hot spot, you can treat them. They usually look red. They'll be slightly painful to touch, just like friction burns would be. And what you want to do is create a barrier between the object and the skin. So you can either put a Band-Aid on. Don't stay put very good because they're going to just rub right off. But like moleskin can work really good, or some athletic tape, just to try to prevent the sock or the shoe, whatever part's rubbing against you, from rubbing directly against the skin to minimize the friction. If you check and you find out you actually have an intact blister, that means it's raised surface, but it's not broken. The skin's not broken yet. What you can do is I have an image on the next screen that will make this a little easier for those of us who are visual, but you basically create a foam donut around the blister. So it essentially puts like a padding all around the outside, so there's not pressure anymore directly on where your intact blister is. So you can use moleskin or second skin, and I'll show you the technique on the next slide. And then the last and third and the least good condition is that you have a ruptured blister. That means that the skin that was covering it has popped, there's fluid oozing out of it, and that's not good because now it's essentially an open wound, and so you need to treat it as such. And if you're on a multi-day trip, that means it's susceptible to infection, and you're going to have to take care of it and change the dressing and such. So it's a higher level of care. So if you can prevent it from getting to there, it's actually going to save you time in the long run. So treating a ruptured blister would be the same way you treat an open wound. So you're going to clean it. We'll get into like the details of how to clean everything a little bit. Clean it, apply ointment, and bandage it. And then you're going to have to check it and replace it. Probably daily, maybe even more, depending on how bad it is and how bad it's bothering you. So that's kind of the overview for blisters. Let's see if anyone's, yeah, I'm checking in the chat. It says the 5 minutes it takes you to treat a hot spot will save you hours on the trail trying to hike with a blister. Absolutely. Yes, and it is very important to ask people before you touch them. Kind of glossed over that, but yeah, definitely ask people if you can help them before you touch them. All right, so this is the visual for those of us who are visual on how to like treat a blister. So you basically cut out a circle of a mole foam, and then you fold it in half, and then you cut out the middle, and that's how you make the donut. And then you place the donut around the blister, then you place your ointment, and then you wrap it to keep with athletic tape to keep put the bandage on first, and then wrap it with tape to keep it in place. So that's basically like how you can hopefully minimize the pain of the blister by basically creating a space so that there's not pressure directly on the blister. So if you don't have moleskin, just keep that in mind. You're just trying to create a space where the pressure isn't directly on and the friction isn't happening right on those blisters. All right, the next thing we have is managing burns. So we talked about maybe the most likely place you're going to get a burn backcountry is either from a fire that you have or from boiling hot water. So the first thing you want to do is move away from the heat source, cool down the burned area. You want to either immerse it in water or put a cold compress on it. Keynote here is it's more important to cool it down than it is to have clean water necessarily. You will want clean water later when you're cleaning it, but to cool it, you can stick it in a creek. You know, the one thing to note, and you probably won't have ice back country anyways, but there could be snow around, don't use snow. Snow is will make the injury worse because it cools it down too quickly. But yeah, if you have like, if you're near a creek, stick your arm in the water. If somebody has some water they're willing to give you from their, you know, they filtered, or even if it's unfiltered water, if you just have a bag of unfiltered water, use that as well. It's okay if it's not clean water. The point is you just want to cool down the burn to minimize it burning further. Okay, once you've got it all cooled down, then you want to move on to treating it. And this is when you want to wash the burn with whatever you have in your kit, mild soap or whatever kind of like antiseptic you have, and clean water. Let's just say clean water. When you get to the cleaning point, you want to make sure it's actually filtered water that you use to clean it. And then you want to apply ointment, antibiotic ointment. And then you want to apply a non-stick layer, either like the shiny gauze or like a second skin. You put that down first, because you don't want to put down dry gauze on it, because then it will like adhere to your burn, and then when you try to like take it off later, it will rip the burn back open. So make sure the first layer on a burn is actually a non-stick layer. Then put a layer of dry gauze on top of this non-stick layer, and then secure that with tape. And then it is a good idea if you're able to take ibuprofen to take some ibuprofen, because not only does it help with the pain, but it also helps reduce the swelling. So that's the steps for managing a burn. So for cuts and scrapes, small ones, not the ones where gushing blood, but just the small ones, you can control. First thing you want to do is control the bleeding or stop the bleeding. You can do that by applying pressure, either with just a couple fingers or pressure, or if it's a pretty big cut, you just want to like just go ahead and like put your fingers on it and just go for it and try to stop the bleeding, because you can clean it after it's stopped. Probably don't have time, if it's a big bleed, to like get into your first aid kit, get the gauze and use gauze. But just trying to get direct pressure on it right away to stop it. The sooner you can stop it, the better. And most bleeds will stop with pressure. And another tip is put the bleed above your heart. That will lower, that will quicken the pace at which it stops bleeding as well. So like things like Jim Durrett sometimes teaches this class with me, and he has EMT background. So he's always talking about closer to your heart, distal and proximal from the heart. But just think about, like, if you're trying to slow a bleed, getting it above your heart makes sense, because it's going to be harder for the pressure is going to be lower, right? If you put it down by the ground, the blood pressure is going to be higher. So getting your arm, or if it's your leg, lay down and elevate your leg above your head, those sorts of things can help it like stop bleeding faster. So once you've actually got the bleeding under control, and then you want to clean the wound with soap and filtered water. Again, filtered water, the screen has the right filtered on there. So anytime you're cleaning, you want to use clean water. The biggest reason here is you just don't want to leave any microbes or dirt or anything in there that could possibly lead to an infection, because again, if you're out there for a couple of days, having an infection is not good. So you really want to, basically you're going to actually want to irrigate the wound. So some tips on irrigating. Irrigating is when you like push some water in a stream in there to make sure if there's any dirt down in the cut that gets like washed out. Essentially, you don't want to leave any dirt or anything down in there. So a couple ways, you either will, if you have like some first aid kits come with an actual little syringe that you can put filter water in. Another technique that works is if you have a plastic Ziploc bag, you can like poke a hole in it with like a safety pin, and then you use pressure, you close it and use the pressure, and it will create a stream of water, right? So you can direct that stream of water. So that's a couple ways you can irrigate it, but it is important to irrigate if the cut is, deep enough that something could have gotten in there. Because if you bandage it up, then it's just going to potentially lead to infection. So once you've cleaned it, irrigated it, you want to dress the wound, very similar to how you dress your burn. Again, similar to how you're going to dress your ruptured blister. You want to have an inner layer of sterile non-stick material. Put down your antibiotic, put down your non-stick material, put on your gauze pad, and then a layer of tape. So luckily, all the different cuts, scrapes, Burns and blisters, ideally the way you dress the wound is very similar. So you don't have to remember a lot of different techniques. You just want to make sure you get it very clean. And then you want to put down the antibiotic ointment, put down a non-stick pad, and then put down a gauze pad to kind of like give it a cushion, and then tape it. So those are pretty much the standard steps for any scrape, cut, burn, or blister. And then change every 24 hours or as needed. Like if it gets wet, you're going to want to change it because wet skin doesn't really heal very well. So that's the steps for cuts and scrapes. Okay, so now we're going to move on to a little bit more advanced injury interventions. Again, I'll do my best here. This is usually Jim's part, but I've seen it enough times it should be okay. If anybody has any comments they want to add, feel free to jump into the chat, and I will check periodically. See if I can, whoops, I can figure out how to do that. Here we go. Doesn't look like we have any new chats. Yeah, so if you have any thoughts on any of these, feel free to add your thoughts. So that we're going to go over splinting, just the basics of splinting, a bigger bleed, what to do if you have a bigger bleed, and then shock. So if somebody goes into shock, what do you do? Okay. And some more things to consider when you're doing your assessment is to not miss a second or more serious injury because you found a first one, right? So like say you found a pretty big cut on the person's arm and you're like, oh, let's address this, and you like start focusing on the arm, but you don't realize they're actually bleeding worse out of their leg. That's why when you do the focus assessment, you don't stop until you've done the whole assessment. You just identify where things are. You come back to them after you've done the full assessment. That way you don't miss something major that, you know, because you found a smaller injury first. Again, if a neck or back injury is possible, try not to move the hiker, or if you do have to move them, support their neck in an inline position. Some of you may have seen a SAM splint. I don't actually have one, but a SAM splint is like a rectangular piece of blue material that's flexible but rigid, so like it will hold its shape. So one thing you can do with that is you can kind of put it around your neck, almost like a towel, and then wrap it like that, and it actually has some rigidity that can keep the neck from moving. You can also use clothing if that's all you have, but just like be creative with things that you have in the field. If you need to do some, like move somebody that may have a neck injury, you just want to be able to figure out a way to maintain not moving there. You want to keep their head stable. So something you can learn more about in details if you take a wilderness first aid class. Yeah, and so for advanced injuries in the backcountry, the best option is to stabilize and move them to a greater level of care or shelter in place. So if you have a really advanced injury, you're going to want to like hopefully either send somebody out to get help, or maybe you have like an inReach and you're like calling for help, and then all you're trying to do is manage the person until help comes, right? Because at some point you're not going to manage certain advanced injuries in the backcountry, but this is intended to help you understand what to do in the time between when you go to get help and when help arrives. So moving them to a greater level of care is to get the emergency responders in, and sheltering in place means you want to keep them warm and hydrated and calm while that's happening. So for splinting, you want to immobilize the injury area and prevent further movement. And the way you do this is wherever the injury is, like say you broke your arm right here, you need to stabilize the joints up and down of that, and proximal and distal to your heart. So but I just like to think of it as like, if you broke your arm right here, where are the two joints adjacent to it? Your wrist and your elbow. So you actually want to stabilize both of those joints so that there's no movement within the break area. And so what you want to do is use something rigid like a hiking pole would be great, or something like a hiking pole along the length of the arm, and then you're going to wrap it. And then what you want to do after you get it stabilized is you want to wrap it to your body so that it's even further not being jostled around. And so you can see here on the screen, we show the sling and swath. So essentially you do is you can even do this with shirts, like again, try to think of the gear you have with you as your tools. And so, yeah, if you have like a shirt, you basically sling the shirt around under the arm, as shown as this is a little easier to do in person, as you can imagine. Put the shirt like essentially around your neck and around the arm, and you can tie it in the back. And then you want to like, that will keep it from moving up or down, right? That keeps the elbow stabilized and you can't move up or down. And then you want to actually like swath it to your body so that you wrap another shirt or pants or something, or a belt or whatever, rope if you have it, around their arm and your trunk of your body to keep that arm snugly in place. You can also do similar stuff like this for the leg. It's a little more complicated, but you essentially just want to make sure that you're stabilizing and minimizing the ability to move. Now, if somebody has a broken arm like this, they can walk out with it. Obviously, it's not going to be very comfortable depending on the severity of it, and hopefully it's not compound fracture, meaning that it's bleeding profusely. But, you know, it's a little harder to walk out on a broken leg. So this one's a little bit more like something you might actually be able to help somebody within the backcountry without additional training. Again, you're just trying to minimize the movement, figure out where the break is, and immobilize the joints up and down on the arm or leg or wherever. Things like ribs, you can't really do much for. Many of you probably already know that. Ribs are just broken and they just have to have time to heal, but something like an arm or a shoulder, or even a leg, you can do some immobilization in the field. And so, yeah, and the other thing to be thinking of is trying to splint in a position of normal use. Jim always likes to talk about it with the fingers. Like, say somebody's broken a finger, you kind of want to make sure that however you splint it, it's kind of like this. So if for some reason they lose their mobility from the injury, at least their hand's in a position of use. Like, they can still use this. Like, if it's like this, you can't do anything with your hand if it like froze in that position. So like he usually will show like putting like a SAM splint, like pretend this arm's a SAM splint, and then you like basically just have the fingers resting over it in that position, so that if you did have, again, that's just one tip he likes to share. Again, splinting materials are what you have with you on the trail. Okay, fun. Jump into the chat. Let me know, what types of things do you usually carry with you in your backpack that might be good splinting material? I already shared the hiking pole. What else do you have that might be good splinting for an arm or a leg? Yep, webbing for tying material. Yeah, I could definitely use that for like the sling and swath. Tent poles, that's what I was hoping somebody would put in. Yeah, tent poles, that could definitely be used to immobilize a break. So what else? Maybe something that you didn't bring with you, but that's in nature. A stick, yep. Bandanas are great for tying the person's arm down, probably. Yeah, when we did the Wilderness First Responder, it was pretty funny. Well, not funny, but interesting, I guess I should say. They send you out on this overnight thing where you're in groups of 5, and apparently everyone has an injury, but nobody else knows that everyone has an injury. And so mine was a broken leg. I had a broken leg. And so we had to find sticks and then figure out how to tie the stick to my leg, and we actually did a pretty good job, and we got kudos from the instructors. So keep in mind that everything around you in nature and everything you bring with you is potential resource for handling these situations, and that's just a nice way to like just kind of think it through. It's, you know, and try to like everything. Like, oh, another one was a good one, is like some of those backpacks that are flexible, like they don't have a rigid frame on them, but they're kind of flexible. You could wrap that around a leg, right? Like you take everything out of the backpack and then you wrap that around the leg. That would do pretty good at immobilizing the leg too. So that was another one that we had talked about. Foam sleeping pads. Yeah, that's another good one. If you have a foam sleeping pad, you can kind of make that into a U shape, right? And then wrap that real good around a leg. That's a really good one for a leg, is a foam sleep pad. Okay, moving on to bleeding. So the human body has about 5 liters of blood at any given moment. and 15% is the threshold for a class 1 hemorrhage. So basically you need to have like this much blood on the ground in order for it to be a class 1 hemorrhage. I've never seen this much blood on the ground. Has anybody seen them? That's a lot, right? Like you might see a cut and it might be squirting blood out of it, but it's not this much blood. So Jim likes to share this because he wants people to realize it takes a lot to actually, like, you have to lose a lot of blood. So if it's not like literally causing a pool of water as big as this on the ground, then, you know, you want to just proceed with, you know, I mean, if it is that much, there's not much you can do at that point. But just to give you some perspective, it's a lot of blood to get to a class 1 hemorrhage. And so the steps will be, if there are multiple wounds, you want to treat the ones closest to the heart first because there's a higher pressure near the heart, so it's going to pump the blood out of the wound faster. So you want to treat the wounds closer to the heart first, proximal, closer to the heart. Learn a little medical terms here tonight. And then you want to stop the bleeding. We talked about this a little bit. It's no different than if it's a small bleed. So first thing you want to do, apply your direct pressure, and then, you know, get right in there. Get in. It sounds weird. It seems like you wouldn't want to put your dirty fingers in somebody's arm, but you do want to stop the bleeding, and you're going to clean it after the bleeding stops. So go for it, as long as they give you permission. Elevate the wound above your head. And so those are the two most basic things, and the most likely things you're going to have to encounter, those two things: pressure, elevate, right? The third is if the person you just can't get the blood to stop coming out. There are some pressure points, and I'm not even really the best person to go over this with you, but I'm going to give you my best shot, and again, give you guidance to take the wilderness first aid class to learn a little bit more. But essentially, in your arm, where the vein goes over a bone is a pressure point. And so if you know, like, oh, my arm's bleeding, and you can get pressure on the vein that's going to the bleed, you can slow the bleed down enough that then the pressure on it can stop the bleed. And so there's some in your arms and there's some in your legs. And I don't know exactly where they are, so this isn't super helpful, but that would be where Jim would go with it. But just keep, you know, just thoughts. The one thing he does say is that the last resort, the tourniquet, is not something that we recommend. It's not hardly ever used, and it can usually cause more damage than help. If you don't know what you're doing with it, like we said before, don't do something you don't know how to do. A tourniquet can cause the person to lose their appendage. Now, if they're gonna die because they have a class 1 hemorrhage, then go for it. You know, they'd rather not have their arm than be dead. But in any other situation, do not try to use a tourniquet because it can cause them to lose the mobility in their limbs. So start with pressure and elevation. And if you need to, try to find some of those pressure points. Anywhere you can feel a pulse is kind of like a pressure point. So if you can feel a pulse, then you know you're on a vein, one of the big veins. So that's a good way to think about it. Anybody have any comments yet? Whoops.
Sarah, can you define what a class 1 hemorrhage is a little bit better?
Yeah, class 1 hemorrhage is the point where you're basically in a life-threatening condition, right? Like any bleed smaller than a class 1 hemorrhage is not a life-threatening bleed, essentially, is I think how I would define it. So, you know, when we were talking about in the beginning, you know, the checking for life-threatening conditions, if they're bleeding but it's not to that excessive level, then it's not a life-threatening bleed. You do want to take care of it, but you want to do it after you've done the full body assessment to make sure they aren't bleeding profusely somewhere else, and then you start by treating the bleed the closest to the heart, and that's how you manage bleeds, essentially. Does that help?
Yeah, so if I understand correctly, you can lose almost a whole water bottle before you need to like hit the emergency button on your spot.
Right. Or if they're bleeding fast enough to lose that much blood, then yes, you want to definitely hit the emergency button on your spot for your class 1 hemorrhage. And you can even tell them that, like, it looks like it's a class 1 hemorrhage, and then they know they need to come like super fast, right? Because if you're losing that much blood, it's hard to stop it. And yeah, it's critical. It's critical if you've lost that much blood. I went past one here.
Yeah, but it takes a lot of blood to get there, I guess. Is what
Yes, exactly. A lot more than probably any of us have seen in real life. Yeah, if you ever want to do like an experiment, put some like red food coloring in there and then go dump that on the sidewalk. It'll give you a visual how much blood actually has to be lost to be in a critical life-threatening. And I think it's interesting, and Jim really points out this, because like you can see like blood, like a teacup full of blood looks like a lot of blood, right? But that's not a life-threatening amount of blood. And so I think the point is to really make you realize how much blood it takes for it to actually be a life-threatening bleed, is the point. Okay. Yeah, and then there's some things that are going to be really that are just out there. If somebody has a main artery bleed, there's not much you can do to stop that. Call for help as fast as possible. And the other thing that's really hard to identify is internal bleeding. If somebody has fallen off a cliff, maybe has some injuries in their stomach or in their head, and there's some internal bleeding, it can be difficult to identify that. Some of the methods you can use to try to figure that out. First, always recommend get your wilderness first responder training, because they'll teach you really well how to do this. But a part of it is when you're palpating like the stomach and stuff, that can help you to understand if there's any damage. So again, you're just basically pushing on different parts of the body with your hands flat and just seeing how the person responds. And so if they have a lot of tenderness in their stomach, that could indicate that there's internal injuries. And then in the head, it's usually that check-in with them to see if their mental capacity is declining over time by asking them a set of questions. So those are like your best bets at trying to figure out if there's internal bleeding. Also looking for bruising, but bruising that might not show up right away. So that's another, internal bleeding is a really difficult one to identify in the field. So shock is a life-threatening condition that occurs when the body is not getting enough blood flow. So shock is an interesting phenomena because it can happen for a variety of reasons. You can go into shock from being scared, from being frightened badly enough. It's not usual, but it can happen. And so basically what happens is, and typically what happens, shock happens when the fluids, the blood is not getting to all the places in the body. So your body essentially will think it needs to conserve energy or blood and heat, and it's going to like pull that inward to your core, and you'll start losing like you'll start losing your ability to use your limbs as much, because the body's kind of like starts to shut down all the processes until you're just keeping the processes that keep your body alive, essentially. So, and it can happen pretty quickly, and it's pretty hard to reverse. Shock is most often associated with the following types of injuries. Blood loss, significant blood loss, because that's already, your body's going to start trying to conserve immediately and go into shock. Start shutting down things it doesn't need to survive. Severe head injury, heart failure, severe burns, severe trauma, and allergic reactions such as anaphylactic shock. Shock is one of those things, and when Jim usually talks about this, he just shares, it's a really hard thing to know and recognize. They'll say, sometimes they'll say in the training, like, if their skin looks pale and blue and clammy, that they could be going into shock. But it's kind of a hard injury, if you will, to identify, because it's happening inside the body. So if you have somebody who's had a severe injury, you just go ahead and treat them for shock, and you don't even like whether or not they have shock, you just start treating them for shock. So how do you treat someone for shock? So I'm going to jump down to the treatment, and then we'll go back to the top. So you basically want to keep them warm, keep them hydrated, stop them from losing blood, make them comfortable and warm, and seek a higher level of care, right? So treatment for shock is something you'll do with pretty much any injury, right? So if you're treating them for an injury, go ahead and treat them for the shock, because it's something you want to do for the person anyways. You want them to be warm and comfortable. You want them to get as much oxygen as you can. You want to replace their fluids and keep them hydrated. Like those are things you want to do anyways. So the method of treating shock is just a normal method of how you would care for somebody and make sure that they're taken as well care of as possible, because once your body feels like, okay, I have the things I need, it will start coming out of the shock, right? Like if it's cold and it's getting colder and it's uncomfortable and I'm dehydrated, it's the body's just going to react, and there's, so the best way to do it is to get your body to come out of shock is to just take really good care of yourself. Some of the vital signs of shock are an elevated pulse. The respiratory rate is increased and shallow. So like you're hyperventilating almost. Again, I mentioned the skin being pale, cool, and clammy. They're becoming less responsive because responding to somebody's question your body doesn't think is that important, and they could have nausea or vomiting. And so the reason why it's really hard to identify is you see this list of symptoms are like all symptoms from a lot of different things. So the skin being pale, cool, and clammy is one that's pretty identifiable because there's not a lot of other things that will necessarily do that. And then also that paired with them becoming less responsive should be pretty, I would just start thinking about shock. If they have pale, cool, clammy skin and they're becoming less responsive, think shock. And then again, the treatment is just to take good care of them and get a higher level of care. That's again another case. If you think for sure the person's in shock, you definitely want to activate your spot device, because they're not going to be able to get out of there themselves if they're in shock. It's pretty hard to reverse shock, and if you can reverse it, it's going to be slow going and they're not going to be able to get out of there themselves. So if you think someone's in shock, you're going to have to seek higher level of care. All right, was there any questions about the shock before we moved on? Has anybody seen shock? Has anyone seen anyone in shock? I have not personally seen somebody in shock. Yeah, so there's a lot more injuries that can happen than what we went into during this presentation. Yes, after an accident, yeah. Yeah, it's really crazy that like you can really go into shock for a bunch of different things. Definitely just being in a traumatic incident can lead to shock, even if you're not highly injured. So just something to keep in mind. Yeah, so we've just gone over a few different things, the basic injuries, and then some more advanced ones, just like some splinting techniques, just trying to immobilize the joints. And I will share with you, when we usually do this in person, we actually like showcase like how to do some of these bandages and stuff. It's just a little bit hard to do over the computer without a second person. It's really hard to splint yourself. I don't know if you've ever tried that one, but that one's a little hard. So you kind of need the second person to help. I've been in shock after a wrist and elbow sprain. Yeah, it can kind of sneak up on you. So okay, so those are the three. We also sometimes will talk briefly, and this class I don't think we're going to get into it too much because not often will you be at elevation, but I do just want to mention that altitude sickness is also something that if you are going to go into elevation, you should learn to recognize. With this class, with backpacking, I don't anticipate a lot of you are going to be going into high altitude situations, but if you for some reason do choose to do a backpacking trip that requires high elevations, I do encourage you to learn about the altitude sickness and how to treat it, because it can be very life-threatening. Okay, we'll move on. All right, so first aid kits. All right, I want to do a poll here. Who likes to build their own first aid kit, and who likes to buy these pre-made first aid kits? My husband needed to be administered oxygen at 14,000 feet after his pulse was racing. Yeah, that could have been possibly elevation. Build your own, build your own, build your own, build your own. Everyone wants to build their own. Yeah. Okay, so I love it. I love that you guys are giving this answer because it's a really good answer. And the reason why it's a really good answer is because the most important thing to do is to know what's in your kit and how to use it. that's more important than having every single tool and technique and medicine in there. If you don't know what's in there and you don't know how to use it, it's essentially not very useful. So when you build your own, you know what you put in there, you know why you put it in there, and you know how to use it. And when you have an injury, you know what you have in hand. Now, excuse me, I have this first aid kit, this little red one on the left. It's a Weekender backpack REI. I love it, but I've taken the time to go through it and I know what's in it, and I know like where things are located in there. And so if you do get a pre-packaged one, that's totally great, especially if you're new starting out. It's good to have all the things and not have to like figure out all the different pieces. But if you do get a kit, make sure that you know what's in there, make sure you know how to use it, make sure you can find the things that are in there quickly, and also make sure you know the expiration dates of the things that are in there and replace them. So at the end of, you don't have to do it every trip, because you'll, you know, do it once a season, before, at the start of the season. Things I'm learning: do these things at the start of the season. Check your first aid kit, make sure it has Band-Aids, make sure your Advil is not expired. Now, expired Advil won't hurt you, but it's not as effective. And do you really want to carry around the extra weight of Advil that's not that effective? No. No, you don't. Like, we don't want extra useless weight in our packs. So making sure that your pills and medicines and all the things are stocked up and in there is important. So there's all kinds of different pre-made ones. I love it. Start with a kit and add to it. That's a good idea. Add or subtract. Maybe there's some stuff you don't want in there. I know Dana Cadwell and I hang out a lot, and she loves first aid kits. So if anybody wants to talk first aid kits, I am sure she would be willing. So there's all kinds of different levels. You can get like the little tiny, like literally goes in a Ziploc bag. It could be for a day hike. Then you can have like a bigger one for a one-nighter. If you're going on a backpacking overnighter, it'd be good for, the way I recommend is that the trip leader has like a more advanced kit, and then everyone else has like a small personal kit, because you don't need 10 sets of tweezers on your trip, right? But maybe you want to have one pair of tweezers or one syringe or whatever. You just don't need 5 or 10 of those. But I do recommend that everyone carry their own Band-Aids, their own, you know, all the stuff for the basic like injuries. If you're gonna have maybe deal with a blister, it's just better that you just have your own little kit to deal with your own blisters, and you don't have to break out the big group kit. But somebody should have some of the more advanced stuff, like, you know, some of the stuff we've gone over. This is a list of an example list. Everyone has their own lists and reasons, and I'm sure we could go back and forth and debate. If you have things that you definitely want that aren't on this list, or things that are on here that you don't think are necessary, feel free to drop those in the comments. I like to get interactions from the group. We'll get a lot more interactions when we do this in person. I keep the chat box open so I can see what people are saying.
Yeah, I guess I would say one of the most important things is to make sure you have what you need. For example, like, I'm not allergic to bees, so you won't find an EpiPen in my first aid kit because I don't need it. But if you are and you do need an EpiPen, make sure that your first aid kit has that. Don't rely on somebody else to have it.
Exactly, definitely. So the other thing I accidentally jumped over, apologize, is when you're treating somebody, you should always wear latex gloves. I feel like I don't have to get into why this day and age, but you know, it's really important as a person being a rescuer or a caregiver that you do not put yourself at any more danger or risk. And you know, if it's your partner or your best friend, maybe you aren't as concerned. But if it's somebody you don't know, you really should be wearing latex gloves to protect yourself from any bloodborne illnesses. I mean, you don't want a lifelong illness from trying to help someone in the backcountry. So I carry a set of latex gloves in my first aid kit, and I recommend you to too. I know it's an extra added item, but it is, and Jim would say the same thing. He highly recommends it too. You really do need to protect yourself. And that's one of the first steps. Super glue for cuts. Yeah, that's a good one. Definitely. You can get one of those little tiny bottles. CPR face shield. Jim actually said his kit has that as well. that's great, because if you're, you know, again, if you're somebody you don't know, you may want to protect yourself, and that helps protect you. One of the other things that Jim likes to talk about when we talk about CPR is really difficult to administer in the field, because like once you start, you can't stop. And so if you're going to do CPR in the field, first of all, get CPR trained. Don't give CPR if you're not CPR certified. And second, you need to make sure that there's more than one person CPR certified, because you need to be able to switch off roles, because you can't keep doing it indefinitely. So CPR is a very difficult thing to administer in the backcountry. Generally advised only if you have at least 2 people that are CPR certified, and a higher level of care is not a significant ways away. Obviously, it's somebody you love, you're going to do it as long as you possibly can. But it's just keep in mind that CPR is one of those, not being able to breathe is one of the critical life-threatening items. So if somebody needs CPR, you need to be calling right away for an evacuation. Trauma shears, tweezers, there's the paper and pencil that I mentioned earlier. Again, it's really important for you to write down. And if you go through Wilderness First Responder, there's a whole, they call them SOAP notes. I'm not going to get into all the information, but you essentially write down when the accident happened, you write down all the information, and that way if you have to call in, you have a documentation to tell the first responders what happened. And it's also a good way to start, if you know, you might be tracking their pulse. Ooh, their pulse is weakening, that's not good. You wouldn't notice that if you hadn't written down what their pulse was. And also, the questions you ask, write down their answers, so that like when you come back, you have a reference. So that's why paper and pencil, even though it's like, how is that helpful? It really is when you're trying to identify what this person might be going through. Because again, a lot of people when they get hurt are going to be like, I'm fine, I'm fine, I'm fine. Like they don't want special attention. They don't like the attention. And so you kind of have to be a detective to figure out what's going on and whether or not they're really fine or not. And so being able to document the symptoms and the change over time is actually really, really crucial to certain injuries, especially like a head injury. Nitrile gloves, latex isn't recommended. Okay, good call. I like that. We'll update this so that it doesn't say latex. Thank you for that. Gauze pads, ACE bandage, moleskin. These are all good. You can probably, some of these you probably don't need all 3 versions of it, but just, you know, think back to the injuries we talked about. You want to have your antibiotic ointment, you want to have a non-stick layer, and you want to have a gauze layer, and then you want your tape. So you at least need those 4 things, right? And then ACE bandages are really nice because they help with the putting a sling on, or they're good for wrapping around ankles, feet. Like I like ACE bandages. I've been using mine. The other day I hurt my foot and I was using mine. Having some ibuprofen is really good. Acetaminophen, so that's Advil and Tylenol. Ibuprofen is actually inflammation reducer, so that's good for burns, or it also can just help if you've twisted your ankle. So like even if the person's like, oh, I'm not in that much pain, and be like, well, it can help reduce the inflammation, which is going to make it easier for you to move around. Like if you have a swollen ankle, it might be easier to move around if it's not all swollen, right? Antihistamine, that is also a really important one. Even if you're not allergic to things, having an antihistamine is really important, like Benadryl, something like that, just in case you have one, because those can be scary. So make sure you have an up-to-date antihistamine. All right, so good comments there. Okay, so let me get my chat box out of the way here. Remember, a first aid kit won't do you any good unless you've been properly trained on how to use it. I think we already talked about that. Okay, so additional resources. I love that I'm able to share some of this information with you. Highly, highly recommend you guys consider taking a Wilderness First Aid course or the Wilderness First Responder course. The Wilderness First Aid course is 2 to 3 days. You can do it over a long weekend, and it gets you certified for 2 years. And it's going to make you feel really confident that you know what to do. They do a bunch of skills classes and like, what do you call it? Like examples, like they'll literally have a person and you have to figure out what their injury is. Like they tell them in secret what their injury is, and then you have to go find out. And that's really cool and really helpful, because like how often are we trying to figure out what's wrong with somebody? I mean, maybe your kid falls down and skins his knee and you know what's happening, but like in a wilderness context, you may not know what happened to this person. You might be trying to figure out. And so having the opportunity to practice asking questions and like doing the assessment is really helps you lock in what you need to know. The Wilderness First Aid is great. It's more of an overview. It doesn't get into some of the advanced stuff, but it definitely will help you care for wounds and fractures and those kinds of things that we talked about today, but in a little more advanced level of detail, plus with the practicing. The practicing really helps. And then the Wilderness First Responder is those who are serious. Either you want to do this as like all the time, you're going to be out there all the time and you're taking people with you, or you're running a business, or you're working as a guide. Any of those things you're actually pretty much required in most of the industry. It's industry standard if you're a guide to have this this training. It is 80 hours, so it is a commitment. It's usually over 10 days, so it's a much bigger commitment. But it's really geared towards people who work in the outdoors. But I thought it was so interesting and helpful, and really talks you through all the potential things. So just some encouragement to learn more about this, and make sure that, like, when you go, like I like to say, it's like when people go with me, I'm like, I'm happy to do whatever I can to help people, but I want them to be educated themselves too, so they're not like relying on the trip leader fully. So that's why I really encourage the Wilderness First Aid course, because then you're gonna be able to help no matter what. So highly recommended. So we actually usually have these classes around here. Obviously right now all in-person classes have been canceled, but here's a couple websites where you can find out about local training. So I got my Wilderness First Responder at Whitman in Walla Walla, and they also have they've done Wilderness First Aid, I think, locally before here in Kennewick, maybe at the REI or something. So, and then you can get them on the west side like all the time. Except for right now. So Knowles is great. That's where I got my training, through Knowles. You can check out their website, Wilderness Medicine Associates, and the Mountaineers. Some of you might be familiar with the Mountaineers. They all have them. They all have these courses. So check it out. All right, so that is pretty much the content that I have for you today on first aid. I'd be happy to open it to some questions if people want to take themselves off mute. That's fine as well. Casey, what do you think?
Yeah, for sure. Feel free to jump in and let us know if you have any questions. I've been monitoring the group chat. It seems like we've mostly addressed things as they've come up. Oh yeah, there we go.
So snake bites. If you are bit by a poisonous snake, like a rattlesnake, that's the one that's going to be the most concerning. And what you do with a rattlesnake bite is you clean the area with antiseptic. And well, first of all, you get the person away from the snake. Let's start with that. Move the person away from the snake, but keep them as minimal movement as possible. You want to minimize the movement of the venom through the blood. So you don't want them like running down the trail, because then the venom's going to go flying through their bloodstream. So you want to move them calmly away from the rattlesnake as much as you can after being bit by a rattlesnake. And you want to keep them immobilized as much as possible. You want to clean off the surface. You want to take off any restrictive anythings, because you're going to swell. So you want to take off watch, tight clothing, anything like that in the area. And then you want to just try to not, like, if you get bit on the arm, you want to like not move your arm, or you might even want to like put it above your head. Just again, what you're trying to do is slow the movement of the venom around your body, and then you immediately call for high level of care. Same here as in the backcountry, because rattlesnake bites can be like really severe. Sometimes they aren't, sometimes they are, and you don't know how much venom has been injected by a bite, because it just depends on the snake. And you know, even the baby ones are, I hear, worse, because they haven't figured out how to control the release of venom. So yeah, you just want to immobilize them, get them away from the stake, keep them calm as possible, try not to move wherever they've been bit, and get a higher level of care to them ASAP. Any other snake, you just probably, if they're not venomous, you would just treat it like a cut. Essentially, you're going to want to clean it, and you know, probably try to irrigate it if you can, and then clean it and then bandage it. If you aren't sure what kind of snake it is, then I would go with, if you're in an area where there might be rattlesnakes. Like, there's not really rattlesnakes in the mountains so much. They're mostly in the like hot, dry areas like Tri-Cities. And they're mostly found around like rocks and like rocky, dry, craggy areas. So the rattlesnakes are not really as big of a risk. Like say if you're hiking in the Cascades, they're not really up there. So yeah, and they tell us in the wilderness first responder class that there's some like snake bite kits out there, but they basically said that they're not real. The only way to reverse or stop the poison is to get the antivenom, and the antivenom for rattlesnakes has to stay in a refrigerator, so you can't carry it around with you. It has to stay refrigerated. But it's rarely fatal. You just want to try to protect the limb, whatever, by keeping them immobilized. Does anybody else know anything more about snake bites? This is just for my training. I don't know if you've had an experience with it or know anything else. Feel free to either unmute or jump in the chat box. Any other questions about specific types of injuries or things in the first aid kit or? So I also wanted to just pull this up. So Casey, do people tend to have this book or is it just a reference?
Oh, we highly recommend it. I guess I haven't taken a poll for everybody who bought it or not.
Yeah, I was just curious because this really has some great tools in the back. Not that you can't get everything online these days, but this is just such a comprehensive resource. So they have like little like prompts that you can go through to like help you get prepared for like safety issues. Like there's a safety issues thing here. It says, okay, what are the activity hazards? What are the environmental hazards? What are the equipment hazards? What are the people hazards? And then what are the steps you can take to minimize the hazards? So you're thinking about this stuff before you go on the trip. Oh, cool. Lots of people have the book. I love it. And there's also there's all kinds of stuff in here. There's also oh, right here. So page 408, there's the fitness and health information form. It's quite extensive. You may not need it all, but it'll give you some good questions to ask. You know, try to get a sense of people's activity level, whether or not they have any respiratory problems, whether or not they have back problems, heart problems. You know, again, I know this is sensitive stuff, but if you're going with somebody that has a medical condition that may need your assistance, it's important for you to know some level of information so you can help them. The practice that I just mentioned was on 412, safety issues. And if we haven't already gone over this, you should also have a trip emergency plan that you leave with somebody. I don't know, do you guys go over that already, Casey?
Yeah, Chuck went through trip planning and emergency management about like hike out versus walk out and everything like that in his safety talk as well.
Cool. Yeah, there's some stuff in here definitely that you could spend some time reading up on some first aid things. Let's see, where is it? I took my bookmarks out last time I was reading here. So let's see. No, not chapter 1.
So one of the things we kind of touched on, but I like to reemphasize, is most times you're going to be in a group. When somebody gets injured, use that person's first aid kit is typically the best practice. They should have everything that they need in their first aid kit. If they have any allergies, their medications will be tailored to their allergies, etc. So when you do come across somebody in the field, and if they are responsive, ask them where their first aid kit is.
That's a good point, Casey. So if anybody wants to learn more and has this book, there is a whole chapter, chapter 9, starts on page 260, and it's a whole chapter. I mean, it's a lot of pages. It's over 100 pages. So you can learn more about specific illnesses, injuries, how to treat it just from this book if you don't want to get a training, but you want to learn toothache, broken tooth, fractured tooth, knocked out tooth. Like they have like everything. So maybe just carry this with you if you're not a lightweight packer. This is a little much for carrying. I'm just kidding. All right, do you guys feel like you can manage your blisters now?
Duct tape and bag balm.
I was gonna say, everyone you talk to will have a different approach for taking care of those types of things, and it's kind of at some degree personal preference, and you'll learn from experience. But I think it's just good practice to try to be proactive, because luckily haven't had to hike on blisters because I've always been pretty good about my boots. I'm just not prone to blisters, I guess. Some people I think are more prone to them, but I've heard some pretty uncomfortable stories about people having to try to, I think it's like you're 10 miles out, you got to walk out. I mean, they're not going to come rescue you for a blister. So that could be an uncomfortable 10, 20, 30 miles out. All
Yeah,
right.
so we're getting pretty close to 8 o'clock. Did you want to touch a little bit on leave no trace?
Oh, was I supposed to do that? Yeah, I can do that. You probably asked me to do that, didn't you? Okay, leave no trace. I thought that Steve went over this. He didn't? 104. Okay, so leave no trace is on page 104 in your book. And the general principles are plan ahead and prepare, travel on durable surfaces. I'm going to come back, so I'm just going to go through these real quick. Camp on durable surfaces. This is not the right, hold on a second. Let's see, I'm completely prepared for this. Here we go. Dispose of waste properly, minimize campfire impacts, leave what you find, respect wildlife, and be considerate to other visitors. So it's really, really cool that more people are getting interested in going into the backcountry. But what's not cool is when you can tell that there's a lot more people that are going in the backcountry. It kind of takes away the allure of being out in nature when you see beer cans, be honest, people's poop and just trash everywhere. And honestly, the campfires and all that too. Like, I mean, having a campfire in a designated spot, that's totally cool. If you are in an emergency and you need a fire to stay warm, that's cool. But just for the sake of the ambience, it has led to a lot of cases of wildfires and forest fires. So travel and camp on durable surfaces. It's meant to minimize the impacts to the environment, right? So there's a trail there, and that trail is worn down surface. Nothing's ever going to grow on there again. If people keep using it, eventually it will grow on there. The way the trails are usually maintained, it minimizes erosion. If you start walking off trail, especially if multiple people go on a similar like path, you'll start to create what are called social trails. And this can be damaging to the environment. It can also make people get confused and possibly lost. If you do decide to go across, if you do go off trail, you should dispersed hike. You shouldn't hike in a line. You should hike like apart from each other so you're not creating paths. Dispose of waste properly. This is both your food waste, anything you bring in, like pack it in, pack it out. So for food, like when you're eating, you want to make sure you aren't leaving any crumbs on the ground. So put those in your trash bag. If you're like trying to wash out your pot after cooking yourself a glorious Mountain House meal, I would recommend, everyone has their own level of what they're willing to do, but I recommend pouring the wash water through a bandana to capture the food particles before dispersing the water. So you want to disperse the water, anything food related, way far away from where you're sleeping, because you don't want to attract bears. That's not really leave no trace. That's just smart. Don't do that. But yeah, you don't want to leave any food. You don't want to leave any trash. So there's probably, I can go quickly over using the bathroom outdoors. You want to be at least 200 feet away from water sources. You don't want to contaminate your water source. You want to be 200 feet off trail. This is like 70 paces. It's a long ways, but depends, if you're doing number 2, you want to get far enough away that you're not, because what the problem is there's like a campsite that people are using regularly, and then people are pooping all around it. And then it's not good. So you want to go far enough away that 70 paces away, there's a big like wide area, so you're not all like on top of each other and it's not there. Because I can tell you, I have stepped in human poop and it's not very fun, and I don't want to ever do it again. So just encourage people to just do the far away. Proper disposal of poop is to dig a hole, cat hole, 6 inches deep, and then to recover the hole. I recommend packing out your toilet paper. Some people say it's okay to bury it, but I feel like it's more likely to get dug up and spread around. So I recommend people bring their own, bring a little Ziploc bag, put it in there, and cover the Ziploc bag with some black tape or duct tape if you don't want to be able to see what's in there. And there's a couple, like you can throw some baking soda or something in there if you want to like minimize the smells, but it's just like you don't want to leave, you know, you don't want to see other people's stuff, so nobody wants to see yours either. So just making sure you're disposing of the waste properly, minimizing campfire impacts. My personal, and again, leave no trace, I feel like it's really great principles, but everyone kind of interprets them differently. I would encourage you to read up on them and take the, you know, take your own stance on how you feel comfortable with these things. For campfire impacts, my personal preference is to not have one unless there's already an established campfire ring, because it's just damaging to the environment. And unless I'm like in an emergency situation, there's not really a reason to have a fire. It's nice, but it's kind of damaging and can, again, I already mentioned, lead to wildfires. Leave what you find. Picking stuff up, you want to leave what you find so other people can find it later too and keep the area natural. I want to jump back to camping on durable surfaces. So you should camp on durable surfaces as much as possible. So that's like where there's not vegetation growing. There's going to be campsites that are already established, and it's honestly better to use those than to create new campsites. If you're in an area where there's no campsites and you have to camp on the vegetation, just relocate your tent every night so that you're you know, like one night of your tent on the vegetation won't kill it, but 2 or 3 nights could kill it. So if you're staying in one spot for multiple days, just relocate your tent every night if there's vegetation, and try to just like be aware of like not putting it on the delicate, like try to find the more hardy vegetation and like not try to like don't put it on top of some wildflowers essentially, because that will kill things. And again, vegetation is important to the environment for many reasons, and one of them is to prevent erosion. And if all the vegetation dies and then it rains real hard, it can like really mess up the environment and cause damage. Respect wildlife. Don't feed the wildlife. Don't approach wildlife. Give wildlife a nice birth. Stay far away from them and don't feed them, because then they become humanized. They get used to humans, and that can lead to problems. And be considerate of other visitors. Maybe don't bring your boombox on your shoulder into the woods. Try to keep your voices down if you're in a campsite with other people, and that sort of thing. And Casey, anything else you think of I should jump in there? Sorry, I wasn't quite prepared for that part.
Yeah, the only thing I think of that really comes up a lot, or one of the most common, is when you're gathering wood for a campfire, make sure you're grabbing wood sticks that have already fallen to the ground and you're not breaking stuff off trees, or you know, getting your axe out or your hatchet out to cut things down.
Mm-hmm.
Luckily, I mean, if you're packing the way we've taught packing in this class, you won't need to carry an axe or a hatchet anyways, and you'll have a lighter pack and a more pleasurable trip as a result. But that's the biggest thing I see a lot of times is when you're gathering wood, make sure you're not destroying vegetation to gather it.
Good point. Yeah, and there's a chapter in the book if you want to read up more on that. That's all I have, Casey.
Great. Any questions about Leave No Trace?
Some of us women would be appreciative if you could talk about the female pee apparatus thing, Sarah.
Oh, the pee funnel?
Yeah.
Well, I personally have not used one, but I hear they're convenient. And I personally just squat and pee because I don't know, I grew up in the woods, so that's usually what I do. But there are a variety of different like tools that you can use. I'm not, like I said, I haven't personally used one, but they can help make it more discreet, I guess, for women. And it shouldn't be much of a problem. Pee is pretty clean. Just rinse it after you use it, and still follow the same procedure that you should, like be a certain amount of steps off the trail. when you do it. And there is this thing called a Kula cloth that's kind of cool. I don't know if you've heard about the Kula cloth. I don't have mine in here, but it's a pea cloth specifically made for backpacking, and so it has antimicrobial materials in it, and so you can use it a couple days, and then if you want to, you can rinse it in between, but you don't have to wash it every time. And so it's like better than toilet paper, because then you don't have to deal like with putting the toilet paper in the bag and all that, and you can just like snap it together and then hang it on your pack. So that's kind of a cool option too, for Kula cloth, Kula, Kula. Was there anything specific more about that you were hoping I would share?
No. That was great. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Also, if anybody wants to email me, happy to take additional questions after the fact, and help answer some more specific questions. So Casey can include my email in the notes. So if anybody does have any more questions, happy to answer them. Okay, Casey.
All righty. Well, thank you, Sarah. Appreciate it. I just wanted to take a little bit of time and thank everybody for sticking with backpacking school this year. We had some challenges, and the pandemic thing is really challenging everybody in our personal lives and also with the school. But I'm really happy to see the amount of people that have stuck with us over these past 8 weeks. It's been an hour and a half every Monday is not a small commitment. So thank you very much for your personal time, and I hope that we were able to provide value for you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Casey, for all you do to set this up. You do the bulk of the work. Yay, I learned a ton. Great info. Thank you. Bye, Terry. Thanks so much. I'm totally freaked out. Wait, why are you freaked out, Dory?
After the social hour the other night and all the scary stories, and then you were talking about splinting, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't know if I can do this. But once we get out there, it'll be fine, I'm sure.
Well, I'll tell you, I've never actually had to implement any of these procedures that I've talked about. I think, that's why I like to emphasize the being proactive, plan and prepare. The types of trips you'll be going on with Casey are not the kind where you're probably going to have any crazy like cliff climbing or anything that's going to put you at risk. And to be honest, bears are not going to be at all interested in a group of however many of them you're going to be. So I wouldn't even worry about wildlife at all if you're in a pretty big group. So really this is more education just in case, because you are far from definitive care, higher level of care. But I don't know, Casey, have you ever had any serious injuries in the backcountry?
I think the most serious thing I've seen was probably somebody cut their hand when they were cutting a peach open for lunch.
And that could happen at your house. So that's just bad luck.
Yeah. Believe it or not, it was on a graduation backpack trip. So we had like 10 people there, and everybody was so excited. There was like 10 first aid kits that came flying out of backpacks. Well, there was like a line of people being like, no, I took the first aid class. Let me at it. I want to do it.
Yeah, I know. It's pretty funny, actually. I think one time when something small happened and Dana got so excited, she said, let me go get my first aid kit. I can't wait to use it. I don't know if the patient feels so great that you're so excited about the first aid kit. But yeah, and that is a good tip that I forgot to mention too. It's good to have a primary and a secondary caregiver during these things, and then give everyone else tasks to preoccupy themselves so there's not too many cooks in the kitchen. So you usually try to have one person be the primary caregiver and the secondary person supporting. because otherwise there can be a lot of different approaches to the situation. So good thought there, Casey. But yeah, definitely the intent is not to scare. I know I talked about some more advanced injuries, but it's really just to give you a sense of knowledge so that you can say like, hey, if I did get in a situation, I know what to do, even if knowing what to do is calling for help immediately. Like, I think sometimes it's like hard to know when is the right time to call for help. So knowing when something's critical enough that you're going to hit that spot, emergency SOS button, I think is part of the process. And again, if you take the precautions, it's pretty low likelihood of something major happening. And I always hike with my inReach, so I feel a little bit better about the fact that I have the SOS button. So if anything crazy, if you ever hike with me, or if anyone who has one of those things, you know that those are meant to have people respond pretty quickly to you. I mean, it's monitored 24/7, so it's not like you're like texting your partner and asking them to call 911. So I highly recommend one of those. They make me feel a lot more comfortable being out in the backcountry, knowing that I have a direct line to an emergency person if something bad were to happen.
Yeah, so Laura, to answer your question, this is our last scheduled class. In theory, we would be having a gear shakedown on Wednesday to prepare for our Packwood Lake trip, but that's going to have to change around again because I still don't think we should be or even allowed to gather in larger groups. So just keep monitoring your emails. I haven't changed the dates yet. Hopefully by early June, we will be able to backpack. If not, the details will come out via email.
And I wanted to say it's so exciting to see so many of you showing up for this. Those of us that put the classes on love backpacking, and it's such a joy to be able to help others learn and be able to get out there and experience it. So thank you for showing up and being interested.
Absolutely. And in this last follow-up email, which you should see on Wednesday, we'll be including a course survey. Every year I get people asking, how can we give back to the club? Or one time I think I had a REI gift card for like $20 show up randomly at my door. I guess I would just ask that if you really want to give back, do the survey. Join IMAC. Like, I don't need anything personally. I'm a Hanford engineer, and they pay probably more than they should, I imagine. But so if you really want to give back, join the club, get active in IMAC. Encourage responsible use of the outdoors. It's a common resource for everybody. We're all passionate about it. That's what I know that would probably make me the happiest. I'm sure it'd make the rest of the instructors happy as well. Get active in the club, join the club if you haven't already, and just responsibly enjoy the outdoors and share that passion with other people as well. That's the best way you can give back for me.